Alright, so in this video we are going to cover the War of 1812. By the end of this lecture, you are going to know about the causes and effects of the War of 1812, focusing primarily on the bombardment of Fort McHenry, the Treaty of Ghent, and the Battle of New Orleans. You will also learn about the Panic of 1819 and the Missouri Compromise toward the end of the video. So let's get started. Make sure you're taking good notes. So James Madison, a Democratic Republican, was elected president in the election of 1808. So he is the fourth president of the United States. As the U.S. was expanding west, the Native Americans responded in a variety of ways. Some of them accepted the settlers, some of them waged war. Many Americans believed that the Native Americans were encouraged and armed by the British to fight against the Americans. So among those who blamed the British for the frontier violence were some members of Congress like Henry Clay. Henry Clay of Kentucky was known as a war hawk because they wanted to declare war on Great Britain. So there are three basic rationales that the war hawks had for entering into war with Britain. The first one was revenge. The war hawks wanted revenge on Britain for seizing American ships. The second had to do with land. They wanted to be able to push the British out of North America so that they couldn't interfere with America anymore. And the last one has to do with the Native Americans. They felt that the British were arming the Native Americans in the West and encouraging them to attack the American settlers. So they wanted to be able to stop them from doing that as well. In June of 1812, President Madison sent a message urging Congress to declare war against the British. Madison argued that the British had not only encouraged Native Americans to attack settlers, but had also interfered with U.S. shipping. Now, for years, the American government had tried without success to stop the British practice of impressment. Impressment is the act of forcing people into military service. So the British ships would stop the American ships at sea. They would remove the men, which of course included American citizens, and then they would force these men to serve in the British Navy. Now, Congress approves Madison's call for war, and the war that follows becomes known as the War of 1812. In many ways, the declaration of war was a foolish action. The U.S. had a small army and a small navy because of Thomas Jefferson. If you guys remember, he reduced the military size from 12,000 down to 3,000. And the U.S. also had no offers of help from foreign countries. So at this point, the British are fighting two wars. The British are fighting the French in Europe, and they're fighting the Americans here on American soil. The U.S. had to deal with the British, which they had declared war on, but they also had to deal with Native Americans that were angry by westward expansion because you now have settlers that are moving into their land. In 1814, the British finally end their war with the French. Because the French war is now over, they're able to turn their full attention and resources to the American war. On August 24th, 1814, President James Madison and his wife Dolly Madison were warned of the approach of the British, and they fled. Toward evening, the British enter the capital of Washington, D.C., and they basically start fires that consumed the city. The White House was burned down, and so was the Capitol building. From Washington, D.C., the British troops moved on toward Baltimore, and Baltimore is located in Maryland. Lawyer Francis Scott Key witnessed an all-night bombardment of Fort McHenry, which is at the entrance of the Baltimore harbor. The citizens of Baltimore had been strengthening their defenses, and American forces were able to turn back the enemy. So when the smoke cleared after the British bombing Fort McHenry, the American flag was still there. In response to this, Francis Scott Key wrote the song "The Star-Spangled Banner," which is today our national anthem. This is a picture of the Star Spangled Banner written in Francis Scott Key's own handwriting. And over here, what you have is the actual flag that was flying above Fort McHenry that inspired the Star Spangled Banner to be written. It's on display in the Smithsonian National Museum of American History down in Washington, D.C. The British retreat of Baltimore lifted American spirits, but not everyone was feeling as patriotic as Francis Scott Key was. A lot of people disliked this war, and it became known as Mr. Madison's War. At the end of this war, people analyzed what good had it done to the country, when in fact nothing really good came out of this war. The national treasury was empty, the capital was basically burnt down, and the British blockade had basically stopped all trade in the US. Both the British and the Americans realized that this was a war that no one wanted, and this was a war that no one was probably going to win. So on December 24th of 1814, representatives of both nations met in Belgium, and they decided to sign the Treaty of Ghent, officially ending the war. All the boundaries between the US and British were returned back to normal before the war, so nothing was really gained by entering into this war with Great Britain. Although the Treaty of Ghent officially ended the war, the greatest victory for the US came 2 weeks after the treaty was signed. This is a final twist to a strange war that was the result of slow communications at the time. Facebook didn't exist, cell phones didn't exist, so news was slow to travel. They didn't know in New Orleans that the war had already ended. So what happens is you have an overconfident British troops attacking the Americans that were well protected. And on January 8th of 1815, you have a Battle of New Orleans that basically happens within an hour. And within this 1 hour, the British suffered 2,036 casualties versus the US suffering only 21 casualties. Now, the Battle of New Orleans was a remarkable victory for the US. It allowed Americans to end this unhappy war on a more powerful and positive note, but it also unified the country, restored patriotism, and made Andrew Jackson a national hero. So now we're entering our next topic of the Panic of 1819. In 1815, the US entered into a period of growth and prosperity. It was doing very well. The Democratic Republican James Monroe had just won the election of 1816, so James Monroe becomes the 5th president of the United States. Monroe and the Democratic Republican Party dominated American politics by this point. Every president since Jefferson had been a Democratic Republican, and the Federalist Party was beginning to fade out of existence. Congress, in an attempt to deal with the financial issues from the war, decided to create the Second Bank of the United States in 1816. Now, encouraged by all this new credit from the bank, Americans were beginning to move westward at an incredible rate because they were able to borrow money from this bank to buy land on credit so that they could move out west. In 1819, the U.S. experiences its first Great Depression, and a depression just means a severe economic downturn. Known as the Panic of 1819, it actually begins in England when London banks demand that the U.S. banks repay back the money that they owed them. American banks in return demanded that the money they had lent out to the American public be repaid. Now, the American public didn't really have the money, so they couldn't give the money back to the American banks, and the American banks in turn couldn't give the money back to the English banks. So it caused an economic downturn, and that is basically what the Panic of 1819 is. So we have finally reached our last topic of this video, the Missouri Compromise of 1820. While the economy would eventually bounce back after the Depression, another problem that year would pose a far greater long-term danger to the US. In 1819, Congress began debating the admission of the state of Missouri to the US. The basic issue at stake was slavery. Missouri wanted to be admitted into the Union as a slave state. Now, several members of Congress from the North objected to admitting Missouri as a slave state, not because they were concerned about African Americans being free, but because they feared that by having another slave state, the Southern states would have too much power in the Senate. Now, the Southern members of Congress replied that the federal government had no business dictating to a state what they could and could not do, and they feared that if they forbid slavery in Missouri, then they could go ahead and start forbidding slavery in other states as well. So after months of a bitter debate, Congress reaches what is finally called the Missouri Compromise. It was signed into law in 1820. The Missouri Compromise has two main points. The first one is that Missouri could enter as a slave state. However, to keep the balance between free and slave states, Maine would be carved out of what is northern Massachusetts. So Massachusetts is giving up a piece of its land to create a brand new state, Maine, so that it would enter as a free state to maintain balance in the Senate. The second part of the Missouri Compromise is that Congress agrees that with the expansion westward, any states that are being created above the latitude of 3630, they would automatically be free states. So any state that was trying to enter into the Union above this latitude line of 3630, they could not decide whether they wanted to be free or slave state. They automatically became a free state. So you finally reached the end of the video. I've decided to break down the questions a little bit more specific to really make sure that you guys are able to go back into your notes and make sure that you have the answers to these questions. So the first question is, why did the US want to go to war with Britain? What happened on August 24th, 1814? What happened at Fort McHenry? What is the Treaty of Ghent? Why is the Battle of New Orleans unique? How did the Panic of 1819 occur? Why did Missouri trying to enter as a slave state cause such a debate in Congress? And then what are the two parts of the Missouri Compromise? Make sure you have the answers to these questions and make sure that you head over to the US History 1 blog to answer your question for homework so you get credit for it. I will see you guys tomorrow in class.